want to thank our sponsor, Boltony Watches, who create unique, vintage-inspired military designs that are sure to turn heads. When Boltony was formed, they looked to be inspired by the past, but focus on modern materials and manufacturing. Their watches have fully automatic movements, sapphire glass, anti-reflective coating, and high-quality finishing on their stainless steel cases. Many watch brands have invested huge costs in marketing and distribution, and these costs are inevitably passed down to the customer. At Boltony, they focus on watchmaking, and being a small company gives them a competitive edge in terms of pricing. Make sure you check them out at boltony.co.uk. Thank you and enjoy. Nugs, when did you become interested in aviation?
You know, from a childhood perspective, I can never remember a time in my life where I did not want to be a pilot. I think my first memories of really thinking about flying were I was adopted. I had two older brothers who went to Vietnam. In the mid-70s, around I think 1974, I was obviously a young chap then. We'd go to the airport when they would come home, and I remember the big deal. I think it was the drama of them coming back from Vietnam, mother being, upset or excited to see them, and that kind of imprinted some impression on me with aviation and a big deal about it. And I think that is what grew me into originally loving aviation and to be a pilot, because there's never been a day in my life where I wanted to be something different.
Yeah, I can imagine it. You didn't wake up and be like, oh, another day. You're like, another day.
Yeah, exactly. It was always something I wanted to do and thought about. I was always the kid on the playground looking up in the sky when an airplane flew over, and so much so that in high school sports, my coaches would, make fun of me, like, oh, there's Tim looking at airplanes again, things like that. So, yeah.
So, why did you join the Marines and not the US Air Force or the Navy?
Well, I got a late start on thinking about the military. I never really thought that as an option. And while I was at university, the Marine Corps have a program, Officer Candidate School, Platoon Leaders class, where they'll give you a guaranteed flight contract if you can pass OCS and pass their physical. And I took that as a challenge. I was walking on campus and there was a recruiter, and I started talking to him, and then a family friend of ours was a former Marine pilot, A6s from Vietnam, and he kind of encouraged me as well. So I called the Marines, talked with them, and they gave me the chance. I passed my physical fitness test, and I had a guaranteed spot in flight school if I could make it through OCS. And at that point, it was all on me, so I could handle that. So.
There's a few myths go around, like, with being pilots. Do you have to be like the smartest in the class, the best at the maths, science, all that kind of thing?
Absolutely not. I was an average student. I was telling my wife just recently that growing up, my parents, they've really valued sport. So I always grew up playing sports. They didn't value, or I'm sure they valued it, but they didn't look at my report cards coming home every 6 weeks and stuff like that. So I was an average student all the way through, but I just was doing something I really liked to do, so I excelled at that, being a pilot, because it was something I really took an interest in.
So can you tell us some of the aircraft you started training on?
In the military, the first plane I flew was the T-34C, the Turbo Mentor. And flew that in Corpus Christi, and then from there I selected jets and flew the T-2 Buckeye. I don't know if you're familiar with that aircraft. It's it's not a very pretty looking airplane, but it was a twin engine jet, and very, very docile, very good trainer. And then from there I went and flew the British Hawk, what we call the Goshawk, a little beefed up landing gear on it, but I flew that for my advanced training, and those were my first three. Selected F-18s, went and flew the Hornet. After the Hornet, I did an exchange tour with the Royal Air Force, flying the Tornado F3. Then I flew the F5 as in the Marine Aggressor Squadron. I was the commanding officer of that. And then after I retired from the military, I flew A4s with Draken International, a defense contractor. And now I fly 777s at United Airlines as my retirement gig.
Brilliant stuff. So let's go back a bit. So is it true that you train as a Marine first, as a soldier, rather than a pilot first?
It really is. You would think that's some cliched Marine thing, but you actually do. Officer Candidate School has nothing to do with aviation. Nothing to do with it. It's all about boot camp for officers. It's just basically trying to make sure you have the fortitude to become a Marine officer. And then after that, You go to the basic school for officers, which is a 6-month-long school. Nothing to do with aviation there either. It's all, just basically fire every weapon the Marine Corps has. You learn how to patrol, kind of be a small unit leader, things like that. So, yeah, you do that. Then after that, you split off and you go your separate ways. And the guys that are going to be pilots go to Pensacola with the Navy to go to flight school. And the other guys go off to be infantry officers, logistics officers, whatever they're going to be after that. And the Marines are a tight environment. Throughout my 23 years in the Marines, I'd still run into people that I went to the basic school with, especially when I did my tour in the Pentagon, that I hadn't seen in 20 years that are, that were artillery officers or something. We all come back full circle and run into each other again.
I'm interested to know, so when you're going through the basic training, do any people switch and think oh, I want to go to pilot training now, or did you know you wanted to be a pilot? Is that
just the opposite of that? There were some people that actually gave up their pilot contract to become infantry officers. Wow. Because they once they got in the basic school, they felt like that was more what was in tune with them, being an infantry guy. And there's a lot of credence to that because, you get leadership, ability at a young age, and, there's something about that and being out there with the Marines. And so I had a few friends that actually dropped their air contracts to go do that. I've never, but at the basic school, I think they would have one or two guys per class that were able to pick up an air contract there, or maybe somebody who had a NFO contract switch into a pilot contract type thing. Don't really remember that happening too much, but it did happen. I know.
So what was the role of the Hornet with the Marines?
Well, we did multi-mission. We did both close air support for the Marines on the ground, and we did air-to-air as well. So we did it all. That was our go everything airplane. After the Marine Corps evolved, they got rid of the A6 Intruder, the F4, and they kind of conglomerated everything into the F-18. So we basically did all missions.
They had the Harrier as well, don't they?
Oh yeah, the Harrier does nothing but air to ground. Actually, I take that back. Now they've evolved, and they do some air to air now. They were able to, they got radar and shot the AMRAAM as well towards the end there.
So what were the strengths and weaknesses of the Hornet?
Ooh, the strengths. I think the strength was it's a pure pilot airplane. By far the easiest airplane I've ever flown. I tell people who are pilots, they ask me about it. I'm like, I could probably give you a 30-minute lecture on what buttons to push and what handles to pull, and they would be able to fly the airplane. Very user-friendly, very easy to fly. So its pilot's interface was outstanding. You feel like you're a part of the machine. Other pluses of it, extremely maneuverable. You can't break the wings off the airplane unless you hit the ground. You're not going to pull the wings off of it. Very predictable, and the weapon systems, especially close in, were very nice. Very accurate bomber. Integrated pretty much every weapon system the Navy, Marine Corps had into it, as far as, bombs and air-to-air missiles. Some of the weaknesses were probably its range. Unless you strapped a couple of drop tanks on it, you were limited by range on it. And in combat, that's obviously a factor, because when you're putting drop tanks on the airplane, you're taking away weapon stores where you could be putting weapons on it. That was probably its biggest weakness, I think. Is probably just the range of it.
Did it do one role better than the other, or was it what's it, jack of all trades, master of none?
I think that is the way to define a Hornet, is a jack of all trades, master of none. It definitely did air to ground better than air to air, and that was just because, not for anything other than the Hornets I flew. I was always lucky. I flew later lot Hornets. I flew lot 18s and lot 15s. The lot 18s I were flying had the APG-73 radar, which was a little bit upgrade to the APG-65 that was in the earlier lots. So the radar was a little bit of a limitation with the detection ranges and stuff for shooting air-to-air missiles. So that was one of the limb facts there as well.
And how did it fare in DACT against the time? I'm guessing you went up against the Hornets, the F-15s, F-16s?
Yeah, I think I've probably did a 1v1 with pretty much everything in our inventory at some point, except fifth generation stuff. I think that, it's all the man in the machine, right? If you're flying against the man in the machine, I mean, there's guys that would teach you a lesson flying an A4 against an F-18. It's just the way it goes. But in general, I think the Hornet does well in a slower speed flight, like one circle, turning inside of each other because of its turn radius and its ability to fly at slow speeds and high angles of attack. So you have to know what aircraft you're flying against to take advantage of your strengths over its weaknesses, obviously. Mm-hmm. An F-15, it's going to probably outrate you because of its thrust to rate ratio, but you should be able to turn inside of it. F-16 is very comparable, the way it flies, What else can I compare it to? You want me to compare it to the F-3?
Yes, go on.
Yeah, I know you're going there. The F-3 is definitely going to outrun the Hornet as far as turning and flying. So, the F-3 was very, it was surprisingly good once you got the wings all the way out, and the slats down, and the maneuver flaps, whatever you want to call them, and it would fly pretty good slow. So, not like a Hornet will, but you would know its weaknesses. I could easily see how you can mess up in a Hornet and get beat by an F-3, in a 1v1.
Did you fly on any large exercises with the Hornet? Oh,
absolutely. I was always on a Marine boat squadron, or we were always attached to the Navy Air Wing. I was with CAG-9 and CAG-2 on the Nimitz, the Stennis, and the USS Constellation. So we would do air wing debts for workup. So the whole air wing, we go out to Naval Air Station Fowl and do workups together. Other times, when we were not in the carrier rotation, we would go to Red Flag up in Nellis and fly there. Did that a couple of times. And then just various smaller scale exercises around the U.S.
Yeah. So did you work with the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy quite a lot?
Mainly the Navy.
Right.
Yeah. The only time I really worked with the Air Force was going to Red Flag.
Yeah.
And then when we were on deployment, once we get in a theater, we always went to the Persian Gulf. Even before Iraq in 2003, we were doing Operation Southern Watch. So we'd go up and fly caps, and in the Air Force, the Eagles would be on a cap next to us and stuff. But not a lot of direct work with them other than some coordination.
Mm-hmm. And did you fly with any European nations who flew the Hornet?
Ooh, no. I never had the opportunity to do that.
No swapping notes?
No, I think at Red Flag, I think the Canadians were there at one point, I remember. But that was, I'm pretty sure I can remember them being there at some point. But no, never really worked with other countries with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you probably have a few, but can you maybe share one or two memorable stories from your time on the Hornet?
Ooh.
Keep them clean.
No. Well, I can pass one story that has nothing to do with flying, but everything to do with the Hornet. When I was my very first deployment on the USS Nimitz, walk into my aircraft, I got blown off the side of the ship.
No way.
Yeah. Me and my plane captain both walk into our an F-14 was in the wire taxiing, and you usually. You walk behind airplanes, and you kind of get used to it. You lean into the exhaust and duck down and kind of and tuck through. You get a little system going how you do it. But he was taxiing over the 4-wire. It was just poor timing. I was walking behind him when he came up on the power to get over the wire because it's like a speed bump. And myself and my plane captain both just launched off the side of the ship.
Wow.
That's a good 70, 75 foot fall in the ocean. I actually thought it was it for me. As I was bouncing across the flight deck, I had all my flight gear on, my helmet, everything. And I had my helmet bag, and I just threw it, and I was trying to, like my hands are going to be able to dig into the carrier flight deck. I'm like a cat probably. That wasn't helping. So I go off the side of the ship, and as I'm falling, I'm thinking this is it, and I was at peace. I was like, well, I guess my mother's going to hear about this now,
Wow.
And anyway, landed in the water, everything inflated, everything worked like it was supposed to, and
that's good.
And now I'm worried, did anybody see this happen? Am I going to be left out here? Because I was in the Persian Gulf, and luckily for me, It was the middle of the day. It was December, but the water's quite warm there still.
Right.
So I was fine. And then I thought I was alone, and then I realized my plane captain was next to me. And so we kind of held on to each other, and the helicopter came and got us. And now it was the embarrassment.
I was going to say,
you know,
was
now
there
we
a lot
feel
of ribbing
shame.
when you got back on board?
Yeah. I felt shame. I remember being on the helicopter, and they're like asked me what my name was, and then they're calling back to the ship. And so all the jets were turning on the deck because it was Operation Southern Watch Flight of the Month. So every plane was turning.
Right.
And so they're all up on the Tower Freak, and they hear this like, we got Captain Tim Golden, and everybody's like, they're laughing. So I say, hey, they bring stretchers up and want to carry us off the airplane, and I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. I'm gonna walk off this. No, I couldn't. I stepped on. I realized I'd broken my leg. I didn't realize it till I got off.
Really?
And put weight on it because all the adrenaline and the kind of, honestly, I was pissed off this happened to me, Yeah. And went to the ground, and they carried me down. So I missed I think I had a cast on for about 2 months, and I just stayed on the ship. Was the duty officer every day in the squadron, miserable, but I was not going to be sent home.
Absolutely.
That wasn't going to happen. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how many hours did you get on the Hornet?
I got a little over 2,000 hours in the Hornet, and flying it off and on, and it's feast or famine in the Marine Corps. When you start deployments, your flight hours go up, right?
Right.
You're flying, I mean, I remember in Iraq in 2003, I had like an 85-hour month, which was huge in the Hornet, to have that many hours in a month, because I was flying like 6-hour sorties and stuff. But normally we'd fly 25, 30, 35 hours max a month during, regular operations.
So we're going to get on to your Tornado F3 exchange, the best looking jet ever. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
So how did this exchange come about?
I came back from my third boat deployment, and I had already punched all the tickets. I had gone to the weapons school. I was a Top Gun guy or grad. And I had finished a tour in Iraq. We had just come back. And right before that, my squadron commander was like, yeah, you're on the chopping block to have to find orders now because, my time in the squadron and stuff. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of options talking to my monitor, and he was like, what about an exchange tour? What do you think about that? And I looked at my options. There was like a Canadian F-18 exchange tour, and then the Tornado F3 exchange. I had never stepped foot in the UK in my life, right? Never even been to Europe. I'd always deployed out in the Pacific and to Asia and the Middle East. So I thought it was fascinating. I thought every Brit, Royal Air Force guy I'd ever met along the way in my career were always top notch and good people, and it just seemed something I wanted to do. So I said, I'd like to do the F3 exchange. And my boss and my squadron supported it, and so it happened, I already had orders in hand coming back from the war, so I stepped off the USS Constellation, and it would have been 2003, summer of 2003, and like 2-3 weeks later, I was on my way over here to the UK to fly. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Did you know much about the F3?
Nothing.
Nothing at all?
No, the only time I had ever seen an F3 was one almost ran into me over Iraq, and then another time, that story, I was leading a 4-ship, and we had joined up on a KC-10. It was me, a squadron mate, and then 2 Tomcats. It's Dash 3 and 4. We were going to do a JDAM strike over TK, Al Taqaddum Air Base in Iraq. And we were all on the tanker. I'd come off first. We go left to right, and I was on the right side of the KC-10 watching everybody else tank. And the pilot of the KC-10 came up and said, hey, heads up, there's an airplane passing in front of us. And I looked up, and there was a Tornado, and it was an F3, passed in front of the KC-10, level with it. It was about a mile in front of it. So, we're over in a combat zone. You see all kinds of stuff. I really didn't even think anything of it. I go, wow. But then I started thinking, well, I know he has a wingman. And I looked back, and right when I looked over, I saw an F3 unload. I could totally tell it was unloading, pushing the stick forward, and went right under all of us. I mean, it was so close I could look down and see the helmets of the dudes in the cockpit as they went under me. And and it was, what's funny, if that happened anywhere else, I'd be a big deal. Everybody make a big deal about it, but it was no big deal. Maybe we're like, oh man, good thing they didn't hit us. We just kept on with our mission.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like just as a side note here, when you see on social media like, oh, these two planes almost crashed, and you're like, no, they didn't.
Yeah,
like two airlines. You're like, no, they just won a story for nothing.
Right.
So what squadron were you assigned to on the F3?
I went to the OCU. And they're in Lucas, and after I finished that, I believe that's 56 Squadron, and then from there, maybe 56 Squadron, the Firebirds, and after I finished there, I went over to Treble 1 Squadron there in Lucas.
So did you have any prior contact with the squadron before you went over, or any like RAF guys, or did you just show up, or how does it work?
The Marine that was there before me, Jethro Cryer, he and I didn't know him until I went on exchange, but he kept up with me. He's a top-notch individual, a true professional, and he would send me information and gouge, like we like to call it in the military, on the F3 before I even got there. And then once I was over there, he was kind of like my sponsor and took care of me. And I went over to Treble 1 a time or two. I tried to not be the kid hanging around the gym after school, after I'm through playing. I wouldn't go over there much, but I would go meet some of the guys. I would see them.
And did he tell you anything negative about the F3 when you were before you went over, and you're thinking, oh, what have I done?
No, not at all. No, he was just like me, excited to be there flying it. Yeah, nothing negative.
So how long did the process take to, I guess, put in your application before you actually were over there and ready to go?
Well, let me see. Before I left on the deployment to go to Iraq, when OIF 1 kicked off, I already had orders to fly for the Royal Air Force in hand. So it didn't take that long, maybe 2 months. I submitted my application. I had to get a letter of recommendation by my boss, and they had they hold a little board at Manpower, headquarters of Marine Corps Manpower, and they take all the applicants, shuffle the deck, and who do they need? Well, who has certain qualifications? I know in the Marine Corps, the F3 guys, they like guys who had been to Top Gun and were Hornet guy experience to go to the F3, just because it's an all air-to-air platform, right? Yeah. The guy that I replaced, Jethro Cryer, was a Harrier guy.
Oh,
one of the better ones in the Marine Corps. He later became a MEU commander, which is a big deal in the Marine Corps. And he came around at a time. There was a time when the Harriers were having engine problems, and they were trying to keep those guys like of his quality flying. So they were sending all those guys on exchange and stuff. So.
And just to get into a bit nitty gritty, did you have to find your own accommodation, or was it sorted for you? Were you on base or off base?
Well, when I first got there, I lived at Jethro's house for a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then we found a house out in town, right there in St. Andrews, in proper St. Andrews. I rented it from a former RAF guy who was renting it out. He was flying for Virgin Atlantic, living in Paris, no, somewhere around France, and he rented his house out. So yeah. It wasn't hard to find, yeah.
So let's talk about arriving on the squadron. What was your first day like on 56, obviously?
It's funny to think about now. I came to my exchange tour extremely intense. I had just come off a tour where I was, in combat in Iraq, flying. I was a mission commander in the air wing and leading strikes, and I was one of the weapons school guys in my squadron. And life was very intense, as you can imagine, living on the carrier and doing that. So I hadn't yet shed that intensity by the time I came over here. So I came over to the Royal Air Force, the 56 Squadron, still with that intensity, like ready to train. I'm used to the high operational turn, the long debriefs, all that stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, and it was great. It was really good for me to throttle back and become a student again, because when I went through with guys straight out of Valley, RAF Valley, straight to the Tornado. And I didn't really know how to take them. I was a major at the time, and they were really nice guys, but I just didn't know how to fit in, because they're even younger than they were, I think, I can't remember, they're probably 21-year-old kids, 22, and they were all awesome and treated me well, even put me in my place a few times. I remember I came to class and there was a note for me. They had these little boxes for each student where they have a note. And there was a note, and it said, you need to call this number immediately about your car, your vehicle on base, before we have to tow it off. Or it was something like that. And I'm like, you know, typical Marine. I'm like, what are they gonna do to my, that's, you know. So I go and call the number. Well, it happens to be the station commander's office number.
Uh-oh.
They played a joke. And he answers the phone. I go, hey, this is Major Golden, the Marine Exchange on base. I heard you guys have a problem with my car or something, trying to get it sorted out. And he knew me. And he goes, Nugs. He goes, I think people are winding you up, mate. This is I think it was Julian Stent. He goes, this is, you know, I'm like, oh no, they got me. You know, he laughed. He thought it was funny too, but he knew immediately that it wound me up. But anyway.
So did you feel welcome when you arrived on
Absolutely.
56? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, everybody treated me with nothing but kindness, and there was a mutual interest. You know, they wanted to know about how things were in Iraq, and I wanted to know about how things are here in the Royal Air Force. Like I said, I was on a grand adventure. I actually feel like I had just entered a Monty Python movie, you know, because that was my only exposure, you know. And, and when I came here, it was just, I was like a kid in a candy store. It was awesome, yeah.
So what was your ground training like, and how did it differ coming from the Hornet?
It was very similar. You know, the ground school was, it had been a long time since I had done any formal ground school training to learn to fly an airplane by that point. So it was very similar. This coursework was very similar. I found it difficult, the systems in the F3, the general system, electrical system, hydraulic system, that kind of stuff was way more engineering intense than it was in the F-18. Right. And I remember thinking, wow, man, this is a lot to learn, you know, digging into that. But then when we got to stuff like radar theory and things, obviously I had that mastered. So I was able to help people in my class with stuff like that, right. You know, just general stuff. But yeah, the training was excellent. You know, simulators, I went to the simulators down in RAF, I believe it's Coningsby.
Coningsby, yeah.
Yep, that's where the simulators were. And I remember the simulator instructors had been there for a long time. There were some, and I found it humorous because that's the way it is in America too. You know, those guys have found their niche, they're there, they've seen it all, they've done it all, they know what mistakes everybody's gonna make, and quite honestly, a lot of them are grumpy guys, you know what I mean? So, yeah, they cut me no slack either, but yeah.
So Nugs, can you remember your first flight in the F3?
I kind of do. I remember flying, and his name passes me now. I wish I still remembered it because he was probably one of the kindest, nicest instructors and a very skilled tornado driver they put me with, kind of for the first 2 or 3 flights to fly with. And I remember, you know, the simulator, the course was so nice here that it was a very easy transition going from flying the simulator to flying the airplane, right? And when I say flying it, it's not the actual flying of the airplane, it's just getting it started, right?
Yeah.
And one of the hardest things for me when I first came over to the United Kingdom, and particularly in Scotland, you know, was once I put my helmet on, my IQ obviously lowers a little bit, and I couldn't understand what anybody was telling me, right? Because things are a little bit different. You know, it's not just the language, but, you know, as a pilot, you understand I kind of know what a controller is going to tell me before they even tell me.
Okay.
You kind of expect something, right? You're used to it. Well, here, they said pretty much what they should say, but it came out differently, and then I'm like, you know, so I found it challenging, that part of it, which makes everything else harder because now you're focused on missing radio calls and things like that. But yeah, no, I had a good time. I think everything went fine with the flight, just basic familiarization flight. You know, working the wings was fun. It was very much a novel to me at that point, right? Because when I went and flew the F-18 for the first time, I was in competition, right? I wanted to do really well at it. I was being evaluated. I already had my wings, but I wanted to do well, and I wanted to be a single seat pilot and go to a good squadron. Here, I had nothing to prove to anybody. So my stress level was much lower, and I felt like I enjoyed it a lot more. It made it fun. So it was very enjoyable. I don't think I had one flight in my whole time flying the Tornado that I didn't come back smiling ear to ear. It was great.
Not bad. Yeah. Not bad time then.
Yeah.
So how did you find working with a NAV, or Wizzo maybe you call it in the US?
That's a very good question, Mike. I had never flown with a Wizzo in the US. I'd always been in a boat squadron, which were always single seat. And I actually was looking forward to it. And I thought it was really great. So, I mean, some of the Wizzos I flew with, like Kenny Reeves, I mean, they were just like outstanding. I mean, they knew the airplane, they knew the radar. John Shields, you know, all these guys were just really good at what they did, and they made it very enjoyable. And once again, going back to the communication thing, for about 6 months, I mean, they'd have to answer all my radio calls for me, you know.
Wow, really?
Well, not, you know, I kind of exaggerate a little bit, but they'd be like, "Hey, mate, they're talking to us," you know, because at certain phases of the flight, I'm the one talking. At certain phases, they're the ones talking. You know, it kind of goes back and forth.
Yeah.
And I'd have a tough time, especially with the Scottish accent. You know?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure they understood me well, but I didn't understand them. Yeah.
And I was interested in this. Did you start picking up like English language, like mate and whatever?
Oh, all the time.
Did you start using that on?
In fact, I was counseled that I said mate too much, you know. You know, because I started using that word, and a friend of mine was going, hey, just so you know, you use mate a little too much. I'm like, okay.
Like, chill out, man.
Yeah, chill out with the mate stuff, you know, because I just didn't know, you know.
Yeah.
But I picked up the good words, too. Like, I still try to use, like, wanker and what some of the other, like, you know, just some of the other words like chav and things like that. I'd have to pick up on stuff, you know.
So funny hearing it from an American.
Yeah, saying chav or wanker or, you know, and quite other few words I don't want to mention here. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So how did the power compare to the Hornet? Because I know the Hornet was probably a bit underpowered as well, like the F3. Could you feel that on the takeoff? Did you feel similar? Or?
Very similar in the takeoff. You know, the Hornet, let me go back and defend my original airplane. What makes the Hornet underpowered sometimes is when you start loading it up with a lot of drop tanks and things like that. So you can increase, like we talked about earlier, you know, the range of the aircraft. And its endurance by throwing tanks on it. That kind of slows the Hornet down. But you fly a slick Hornet, it's a rocket ship, especially one of the later model ones with the bigger engines, the EPE engines. You have like 4,000 more pounds of thrust. And you can really notice a difference. Tornado felt very similar to the Hornet on every aspect of its thrust to weight. When you light the burners, take off and stuff. Yeah, I didn't notice much of a difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you talk us through some of your flying training on the Tornado?
As far as how the training went? Or?
Yeah, like what kind of stuff did you practice?
We did the gauntlet. You know, I thought it was great because I didn't have to focus anything on air to ground, you know, the F3. And so, it made things easier for me. It was less things to think about or know. We would do basic, after you got familiar with the airplane, we do basic 1v1s, we do basic TAC form flying, you know. And then we'd move into air combat training, you know, beyond visual range stuff, 2v2, 1v1. Didn't really do any 4v stuff in the OCU that I remember. It wasn't until I got to Treble 1 that we started doing that. But the training was very similar to what we did in the US, you know, almost identical, you know.
So how did the F3 handle, and can you compare it to the Hornet maybe?
Well, the F3 was, not as user-friendly. The Hornet, you know, I don't have wings that I have to move, so that made a difference. Also, one thing I want to note, with the Hornet, you jack the throttles around a lot, especially when you're flying slow or doing 1v1 against somebody else. You know, a lot of times you might find the throttles fully at idle and full at afterburner, and you feel very safe in that airplane doing it. The F3, I think the engines handled it well, but there was a spot, any F3 pilot will tell you, you know, you go to idle and then you throw it right back in the burner. It makes a loud boom because the fuel accumulates in the burner cans. It makes a big pop. And I was bad about that. I was counseled quite a bit, like, hey, be easy on that. Because it is kind of unnerving the first time it happens. You don't know, did I just blow the engine or something? But it just makes an audible sound. So the engines aren't as durable in that sense, which, you know, has a little bit of a factor in how you fight the airplane. But I thought it flew great, especially once again, you know, when you got the wings back, just trying to go straight, level, and fast. I mean, any plane does that. You throw the wings forward in the F3. I thought it flew great. Because the wings were manual, I remember there's a fine point on, you know, when I first started flying it, I had to be a numbers guy, you know, like the speed, you know, and the wing setting, and it was just one more dynamic to think about. But over time, and with good instruction like Roy McIntyre, you know, in the squadron, he'll teach you real quick. You can feel the wings. They talk to you. They start vibrating. So you're flying along, you know, you feel the wings, the airplane's like kind of talking to you, like some kind of hum that you just perceive, right? and you know you need to pull the wings back a little bit more, you know, and you keep doing that, you know. And then there's a fine line too when you put G on the airplane, like coming to merge with somebody. You know, you would like to get as much wing out there as you can for maneuverability. And there's a fine line, like, you know, pulling on the airplane, going 45 to wings full forward. I think it's 25 wing. I haven't looked at my numbers. It's been a long time, but it's starting to come back actually. But you know, you're throwing that out there at the right time too. So that adds a certain dynamic to fight in the airplane that you don't have to worry about in the F-18, you know, or think about. Where I talked about earlier being a more user-friendly interface, but by all means, you know, it's just like riding a fancy bike versus the cheap bike. If sooner or later you get used to it, and with good training, you don't even notice the difference anymore, you know.
One of my dreams is always to fly an F3, just put the wings into 67 full burn. I think that must have been incredible to do.
Yeah. You know, you didn't do it that much, but yeah, you know, it would get going pretty fast. You know, I remember doing low level here in the UK, which I was really cool to do, because in America, that's a big process because of the airspace and, you know, noise complaints. And they seem to love it here, you know. And and I would go down Loch Ness with the wings 67, you know, it's you know, obviously not supersonic, you know, but you'd be going as fast as you wanted to. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, I mean, forget about Nessie. I want to see, you know, this is just cool. You know, and you know, back it up to a funny story. I remember I was walking for a flight, and this is another thing great about the Royal Air Force and the, you know, and the United Kingdom in general, is we're walking to a flight, and the duty officer said, "Hey, you guys are," I can't even remember the ranges or whatever now, but you guys are we're up in the Highlands somewhere, going up there, and we're gonna do something with some GR4s, right? And he goes, "Hey, you guys are in this area, you know, so-and-so's called and said he sees you guys all the time. If you have time, he's having a garden party. If you guys could fly over his house." And I was like, "Is this serious?" And the flight lead was like, "Oh yeah, what's his coordinates, you know," figured out where he was. Wow. We actually saved enough gas to fly by this guy's house. You know, he's a British citizen, or, you know, he deserves to, you know, have some of the taxpayers, you know, benefits. And anyway, we had enough gas on the way back to Lucas. We circled over his house, and the flight lead was like, "Yep, that's it." He could see everybody in the backyard waving and stuff, and went down there and flew over the dude's house. It was pretty cool, you know. In America, you would never do that.
I don't think you would get away with that now.
Oh yeah, you know, in America, that would have been your last flight. You would have landed, been over for you. You know, so.
I've heard similar stories to that, like when you fly above and they're like, yeah, just give us the coordinates. It just sounds crazy.
Yeah, it's real crazy.